Now, what does that mean? Here, at my cellular level, where my cells of this tissue are doing their job, what is the only thing a cell can make?
Protein.
A protein. So that means somewhere on my chromosomes, there's a gene that is coding for that cell. That cell needs to make that protein. But in order for that cell to do that, it's going to need energy from something that looks like a kidney bean. What is it called? What is that organelle called that makes my mitochondria? My mitochondria carries out what process? What's the process called that makes ATP? In the mitochondria. All right, Krebs cycle's involved. Do you remember what that's a part of? Now, that you're thinking about plants. Okay, plants will do that. Cellular respiration. Does everybody remember that? Okay, so my process of cellular respiration is being carried out. In order for that process to occur, I'm at the cellular level in this tissue. For that process to take place, it requires oxygen. Is everybody with me so far? It is the job of my red blood cell to, number one, transport oxygen. Okay? So, as that red blood cell makes its way from the heart to the arteries, to the arterioles, and there's a little more things, but we'll learn about that in the vascular chapter, and they make it to this arterial side of the capillary bed. When I get to the structure of a capillary, these vessels are a single cell layer thick. And my red blood cell that is traveling in the blood, when it makes it to the arterial side, it has to go through one cell at a time. That is how small the capillary bed is. By having a vessel that small, and how many did the other slide tell us that we have just in one day's time? The making of red blood cells? 200 million? A billion. When they get to the capillary level, they got to go through one at a time. Think about that for a second. One at a time. Because that capillary bed's vessel is so small that that red blood cell, which is microscopic, can only go through one at a time, and as it goes through, it's getting squeezed because the vessel is so small. So guess what happens at this arterial side of the capillary bed to the oxygen it's carrying?
It drops it?
It's pushed off. It's dropped off. So as that one little red blood cell gets squished through those vessels, it throws off my O2. My O2 is now out here in my extracellular fluid. Now, this process of cellular respiration, what is the byproduct or the waste of that? What gas?
CO2?
My CO2. So, my cell, as it did its job, the waste is the CO2. So my CO2 gets out here in my extracellular fluid. Can that remain in that extracellular fluid? No, it's toxic to us. So now over here on the venual side, the veins that are going to carry it back to the heart, guess what? Huh?
It gets the CO2.
It'll pick up the CO2. Does everybody see how that worked? Now, that red blood cell that traveled from the arterial to the venual side, from artery to vein, okay? Yeah, we now call it no oxygen. We're now saying that red blood cell has no oxygen. Not necessarily. But just don't worry too much about that right now. Okay? Now, what it can do on the hemoglobin, on the protein that brought oxygen to the arterial side, okay? Well, yeah, it could pick up a CO2, but it really doesn't want to. So what will it do? It has that enzyme that when the CO2 crosses into that vein side, because CO2 will be in fluid now, CO2, when you put it into water, creates carbonic acid. So the CO2 that crosses over into the venual side, if it is not picked up by the red blood cell itself, the red blood cell will help buffer the blood going back to the heart. It can release that enzyme, and that CO2 can be buffered. Because what did we say about the pH of the blood? We've got to keep it between that roughly 7.35 to 7.45. Well, if it is my 7.4 coming on this side, but over here where I'm picking up CO2, where it's going to be made a little more acidic, because CO2 in a liquid environment creates an acid, I can't have that. So the red blood cell has the ability to help buffer the blood so that it doesn't have to carry the CO2, but allows transport to the lungs so the CO2 can be breathed out. Are they not the coolest little things in your body? One of them. As y'all know, I think everything's pretty cool in the body. So, any of that make sense? Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay? So, some of the other things about the red blood cell. The plasma membrane, because it's a cell of the body, all right, it has glycolipids. What's a glycolipid? Now, let's think back to our plasma membrane. What's the structure of it? What?
Bilayer.
It's a phospholipid bilayer. This is the case for any of the membranes of the cells in our body. And do you remember how we have all the proteins embedded in it and that sort of thing? Well, this time, this is a glycolipid. Glyco is going to tell me what?
Sugar.
Sugar. Sugar chain. And that sugar chain is attached to what? One of my lipids. So on the plasma membrane of the red blood cell is going to be a sugar chain, okay? And that determines blood type. The structure of that determines the blood type. The cytoskeletal proteins. You remember our cells, one of the ways that we get structure, because our cells are animal cells, they have to be able to do this number, all right? If not, they'd all be rigid, all right? And they'd be rigid, and it wouldn't be a lot of fun for life, okay? So, having the ability to squish, move, blah, 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 is due to the cytoskeletal properties. In the red blood cell, it definitely needs that ability because basically a red blood cell travels around the entire body, meaning leaves the heart, returns to the heart every minute. So every minute of every day, of every week, of its 120-day lifespan, it's got to squish. So that's a lot of work for that poor little red blood cell. Now here's what happens for us to produce the red blood cell. Eryth, meaning the red, okay? So giving rise to that, just that only, for the red blood cell, is termed erythropoiesis. It is the production of this one and only red blood cell from, do you guys remember what we call the colony-forming unit of that hematopoietic stem cell? So, if we think back to the stem cell, you remember how I showed all the arrows coming off of it? Okay, this is from the one that gave rise to all the little formed elements except the lymphocytes. Okay, so we have our colony forming unit. This gives rise to an erythroblast of the cells of the body. Blasts, class, remember all of that? What does the blast do? Gives rise to. We think of it because what we've studied to this point is an osteoblast, which gave